Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. You can see people are joining us. Just going to pause a few moments and let a few more people filter in so many can join us before we get started, but we will get soon. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Matt. I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live on this President's Day. We're very excited to bring you tonight's event with John Avlon for his excellent new book, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. John will be joined in conversation tonight with John Dickerson of CBS News. But just before we get to that, a few brief housekeeping points. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat column to purchase Lincoln and the Fight for Peace on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask the author a question by clicking on the Q&A button, which you'll find down near the bottom of your screen. And while we'll try to get to everyone's questions, we apologize in advance if we can't get to yours. Also, we're providing closed captioning, and to find those, just click on the CC link that's next to the Q&A box down near the bottom of your screen. Tonight, we welcome John Avlon to PNP Live to celebrate the release of Lincoln and the Fight for Peace, his new book, which reveals how Lincoln's character informed his commitment to unconditional surrender, followed by a magnanimous peace. Lincoln's plan to win the peace is his unfinished symphony, but in its existing notes, we can find an anthem that can begin to bridge our divisions today. John Avlon is a senior political analyst and anchor at CNN. He's an award-winning columnist and the author of Independent Nation, Wingnuts, and Washington's Farewell. Tonight's moderator is John Dickerson. He is CBS News chief political analyst, senior national correspondent, and the CBS Sunday Morning Contributor. He recently published his third book and second New York Times bestseller, The Hardest Job in the World, The American Presidency. John Avlon, John Dickerson, welcome to PNP Live. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew. John, it's great to be with you. And I don't have to worry about remembering your name because it's one that's familiar to me. So, and John, I am grateful for your book as someone who pays a lot of attention to presidential history and is a big fan of Lincoln. So I not only enjoyed it, it's a great book, but I'm also grateful for it, which is a different category because when you read things and they become useful to you in the way you think about the office, it's a gift. So congratulations.
Thank you for doing this. I'm a huge admirer of your work. So I know we're gonna have a lot of fun this conversation.
Yes, excellent. For those of you who are wondering what's happening behind me, I'm in a hotel room. That's not the design choice of the Dickerson household. We prefer blank walls. So John, let's start at the beginning where most people start. Where does the idea for this book come from?
It's a great and an important question. As you know, as an author, I'm a big believer in writing the books you want to read. And sometimes they exist already and sometimes they don't. The genesis of this book came in a quote I found from General Lucius Clay, who was the general who oversaw the American occupation of Germany after the Second World War. An enormously important figure. It's sort of the archetypal good occupation, but someone who's been somewhat forgotten today, despite his many strengths and feats. And he was a Georgia-born 3 decades after the Civil War, son of a 3-term Georgia senator who himself succeeded a Confederate general in that office, and was asked by a reporter during the occupation of Germany what guided his decisions. And he said, "I tried to think of what Abraham Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived." And that made a huge impression on me. And even though it was probably a decade and change before I began work on this book, it really provided the seed because it's the legacy of Lincoln's idea and how his vision for winning the peace, which is one of the problems that bedevils us to this day, hadn't really been collected in one volume. But the way it was fairly coherent, even though he never had a chance to implement it, and then the way it echoed on through history to the occupations of Germany and Japan and the Marshall Plan. That was the scope and the scale and what the book's about. I think probably somewhat to folks' surprise once they start digging in.
Right, it's news you can use. I mean, I've always felt like the presidency is a job where history is the user's manual. I mean, you can you can look to your predecessor, your immediate predecessor, but there are lessons that you can find in history that without too much torture can be applicable today. And certainly World War II is a pretty good distance away from Appomattox and the end of the Civil War. So if we're building, I mean, there's so many extraordinary things that when you think of it in the present mindset that Lincoln did in his moment, and we'll certainly get to those. But I mean, Lincoln's equanimity, he has, Matthew mentioned this already in his intro, but there is two things strike me. You have on the one hand, Lincoln pushing for unconditional surrender. And so take us to the Hampton Roads Conference, set the scene for us a little bit, because this is a book about Lincoln's incredible sense of fellow feeling and smarts about the Confederacy, but he was no softy. So
not at all.
Tell us about what's happening at Hampton Roads and about unconditional surrender.
Hampton Roads is one of the most dramatic moments, I think, of any presidency. You have a president attempt to negotiate a peace with leading Confederates on the River Queen, which is sort of the aquatic Air Force One of its day. And they're coming to offer peace. But Lincoln refuses it, not unkindly, not brusquely. He is a student of people. He is a man of peace in a time of war, and he really is defined by an interpersonal absence of malice. But in that meeting with the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens, a Confederate senator, and a member of the cabinet, he pushes back fundamentally on their demands for peace. And he says, look, you all have three indispensable conditions. Resumption of the federal union. You're recognizing the authority of the United States again. An end to slavery for all time. And then crucially and importantly, he refuses to accept ceasefire before surrender, which is what they're offering. Indeed, they actually have a completely bizarre idea. They suggest perhaps that that the North and the South should reunite to invade Mexico, and then they'll deal with the details of peace later. The reason Lincoln is digging in his heels when people all around him are saying, we can end the war now, accept peace, he realizes that will not be a peace that can be sustained, because what he's concerned about is that if he grants a ceasefire before unconditional surrender, that there will be backsliding on an end to slavery. The 13th Amendment won't be ratified. And then if you don't accept defeat and remove the root cause of the war, slavery, that just sets up the conditions for a new civil war. So it is not the popular move, but it is the right move. And indeed, that's precisely what Woodrow Wilson gets wrong in the run-up to the Treaty of Versailles. So Lincoln is incredibly far-seeing about that point in a time where he's not guided by any precedents. There is no precedent for what Lincoln's dealing with.
Yes, and to raise the stakes, there's no instruction manual, but choosing to prolong the war, we're talking about massive carnage that's happening day by day. And we'll talk about that with Richmond and when he goes out to see the fighting and the sense that you convey of that real anxiousness about, every hour that this war continues on, it is the piling up of limbs, the piling up of bodies. This is not, this is carnage that's continuing as he insists on unconditional surrender. One of the great lines from that meeting is Senator Hunter, who says, what you're saying, Mr. President, is that we of the South have committed treason, that we have forfeited our rights, and that we are the proper subjects for the hangman. Is that what your words imply? Lincoln says, yes, that's about the size of it. So what I love about that scene is he treats them cordially. In today's world, even being on the same ship with the Confederates would be, people would just, the entire country, like everybody would melt down that you're even with these people. And yet he's being quite firm on the question of ultimate surrender. So in the end, no deal.
No deal. I mean, it's a little bit of a Reagan at Reykjavik, but what's so interesting is if you read negotiation books, especially the ones that draw on history, the getting to yeses of the world. I mean, Lincoln is intuiting what are considered best practices. He is cordial. He is disarming, but he is very firm on his bottom line, where, and he knows, what's sometimes called a BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. He's willing to continue the war. He's just been reelected, so he's got political capital. He's just passed the 13th Amendment, although it's got to go through the states. So he's got real capital to spend, but he is willing to be both cordial and tough in order to make sure that the great goals of the war are not given away. He's willing to be incredibly flexible on details, but not on the 3 unconditional issues. Where did he get that? You mentioned he's intuiting what is now the subject of hundreds of negotiations books, but he was doing, 2 things. Where did he get it from? And as you mentioned, he'd had a bumpy career. It wasn't like he had just risen up the ranks with one success after another. The exact opposite. Here's somebody who comes to the presidency with the nation on the verge of civil war, whose election spurs the civil war because the other political party refuses to recognize his legitimacy, and it sparks an insurrection in ways that are not dissimilar to some of the dynamics we're seeing today. But Lincoln, it represents an upstart third party. He's a one-term congressman. He's never held executive office. He has no military experience. So people are petrified that he's setting the Union up for failure. What makes the difference is his capacity for growth and character. And character is clearly, as you as a student of the presidency know, it is the factor that matters more than anything else. And Lincoln's character is rooted, as I say in the book, as these 3 qualities: empathy, honesty, humor, and humility. But you ask what guided his approach in the negotiation. I think, and it's something I cut from the book in an attempt to make things streamlined, but I think his experience as a lawyer. Yeah. He's somebody who would rather negotiate a settlement than go to court. I do think his legal training causes him to try to empathize with the other person as a means of reasoning with them. And you see that in his political dealings, and I think it's a legacy of his time leading the Whigs in Illinois and his one term in Congress. But where he really does try to persuade using empathy. And that's an indispensable negotiation tool. At the end of the Hampton Roads, he asks, I can't remember, who does he ask? Where he says, is there anything I can do for you personally? In other words, it's all broken down. He could just leave the room, but he is. So I guess what I'm wondering is, so some portion of that is obviously Lincoln. He's got that sense of empathy. He's got to hold these people close for what we're going to get to, which is his conception of how you treat the losers. But also, what portion do you think is Lincoln, and what portion do you think is kind of the norms and standards of the day that allowed these kind of weird relationships where you had, wasn't there a snowball fight in the middle of the Civil War? There was the one instance where the North and South sing in unison across, I can't remember the river, but there are these moments of recognition that we're all Americans in the middle of this massive carnage. Yeah, and indeed, immediately after Appomattox, you see that awareness cascading through the divided lines. Look, but I do think Lincoln's determination to exhibit an absence of malice is unique. Politics is all about throwing rhetorical red meat and dividing the country literally up to us against them. And one of the things I was so struck by is even in private, he does not demonize people he disagrees with. In private, he calls Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee people who literally are traitors to the Union. And he calls them in private, not some, vindictive name. He calls them Jeffy D. and Bobby Lee. And I think it's almost the subtle reminder that the Civil War is ultimately a fight between brothers. And the key point Lincoln understands is that in the Civil War, you cannot simply pound the opponent into submission. You need to find a way to live together again. But his decency, we sometimes forget because Lincoln's put on a pedestal and acknowledged, I think appropriately, as our greatest president. He is bookended by 2 of our worst, objectively. Oh. Buchanan and Johnson, even by contemporary standards, are unbelievably bad. So Lincoln's the outlier. And it really is his decency that makes a difference. And you're quite right. And they really are, especially when you read about Lincoln and then you see the way that they behave. It's really
they do not come off in relief by comparison. They really come off as awful. And then we should note also, Thaddeus Stevens and others were pressuring the president to pound the Confederates into the dust. I mean, so in other words, this was not a cost-free position. He was taking this general sense of empathy with the defeated. I mean, they're not defeated yet. I'm getting out of the story, but he was getting pressure from his side.
100%. And he's getting it throughout his presidency. And it really hits a crescendo in the final, days and weeks of his life. And he is anticipating a fight with his Republican allies. Sometimes it's a difference of degrees. Sometimes it's a matter of style, but very often it's a matter of substance. I mean, Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans want to rip up the South by the roots and remake it. And look, there are ways that, viewed from a contemporary lens, that you can see their commitment to an immediate multiracial democracy is very resonant to what we would like to see in America in the 21st century. Lincoln is a gradualist, and Lincoln is trying to bring everyone together towards this horizon of reconciliation. So he has been fighting with the radicals. He's certainly been literally fighting with the reactionaries, and he's in this position as a reconciler, trying to win the war, but then reunite the nation. And the way he does that, and his vision of doing that, which we'll get to, I think is simultaneously rooted in sort of a respect for his opponents as individuals, and also a determination to differentiate between the Confederate leadership and the rank and file who he feels has been misled.
Yeah, and he lets. We'll get to this, but when he talks about letting the rank and file go back to their farms and basically go back to their lives, if you'd like, let them have their horses to plow with, and if you like their guns to shoot crows with,
Give them the most liberal and honorable terms.
Yeah. So things don't happen at Hampton Roads. So then there's this other, to me, which is extraordinary, is Grant writes him a letter and says, "Can you not visit City Point for a day or two? I would like very much to see you, and I think the rest would do you good." He's inviting him to the war. So How is that? That doesn't sound very restful.
Only by comparison to Washington at the time. Lincoln is exhausted by the time that his second administration is starting out. I mean, he is not clearly the lowest point for him personally, and in some ways the nation, is the winter of 1862. That February, March, his son Willie dies. Lincoln is deep in despair. Finds strength through faith. I mean, Mary is completely immobilized. They're fighting all the time. The Union is suffering vicious defeats. And yet still, at that moment, he rallies forth to work with Congress to pass some of these wide-ranging acts that create the context for a durable peace after the fact. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Homestead Act, the land grant colleges, these things that end up moving the nation's, with Lincoln's very intentional direction, trying to move the nation's future focus west rather than focusing on the North-South divide, which had, of course, erupted into the war. But he was exhausted. He said, sometimes I think I'm the most tired man in the world. And Grant does offer, invite him to the front lines, where his eldest son Tad is now serving as an aide de camp. City Point, which was renamed Hopewell, Virginia, which I visited in my research for this book. It was briefly the world's busiest port. It was built out of nothing, captured by Black Union troops who are the unsung heroes of the war, who in some cases were literally written out of history, including the fact that they're the first regiment that actually enters Richmond. And that honor is basically taken away from them in the eyes of history for a long time. But City Point is bustling, and its own, it just shows the might of the North compared to the weakened supply lines and the desertions on the Confederate side. So Lincoln takes this risky trip up, and he sees combat up close with Tad. And Mary there, they are on the front line. So no, it's not anyone's idea of a vacation. And yet, because he's away from the grasping nature of Washington, which is part of what exhausted him, that, people constantly asking for offices and, appointments and such. I mean, he briefly goes to attend a German opera, not because he likes opera, because he can be alone for 3 hours. You know,
No offense to German opera.
no offense to German opera. I mean, Lincoln loved music, but not you typically that type. But it's just this incredibly dramatic moment of his life, right towards the end, where all these extraordinary things happen. And so what I did in the book is I tried to go really close focus on those final weeks.
Yeah, well, it's worth it. I mean, and there's also, I mean, don't spend a lot of time on it, but give us first of all, Mary Todd Lincoln, I never realized that she held her husband's pants hostage before a cabinet meeting in one of their rows. That was a detail I didn't know. But what strikes me is he's there, the war is raging, and then she causes a significant bit of business. Give us a sense of that, only because here you have somebody who has had bouts of depression in his life. He's had one child die. He's got these people gnawing at him in Washington, and the home life was not exactly stable.
The opposite. Mary was in great despair due to the loss of Willie, and probably medical treatments at the time and her own disposition. So no, Lincoln did not have a stable home life to repair to. And indeed, some of the contemporaries at the time around them think that was one of the things that contributed to his swings. His own. Lincoln is somebody who combines opposites, and one of them is this sort of swing between comedy and tragedy, and depression and optimism or humor to a point where it actually irritates some of his contemporaries because they're trying to figure out why he's telling jokes all the time at inappropriate times. It's an extraordinary moment where Lincoln is joining General Meade and General Ord and Mary Ord, General Ord's wife, to see to review some troops. And this is hours after one of the last great Confederate offenses in the war that takes place like a mile from where Lincoln is. Mary is riding up next to Julia Grant on these sort of corduroy roads, and it's slow going. And she gets there and she sees that Mary Ord, who's an attractive woman and an accomplished equestrian, is riding alongside the president, and she flips out. She thinks that the soldiers will think that Mary Ord is the first lady, or she thinks that Mary Ord is flirting with the president, and she launches into her in a really public denunciation, and then goes back for a second round that night on the River Queen, where Lincoln at a party where Lincoln has to sort of walk her back, and they have this brutal row, and he's trying to not betray any emotion, trying to protect her from herself, as it were, but also diffuse. And she's demanding that the generals be fired for this insolence that she imagines. It's a very ugly but very human moment.
Yes. And that was going to take me to the dream, but I don't want you to tell the dream because we can't eat up every fantastic scene in the book. And I don't want to run out of time before we get to a couple of other things. And so people will just have to buy the book and read about the dream in addition to everything else. But that's just a great, it's just, anyway. Okay, Richmond. So also what strikes me is so often in the book, there are people describing the suffering that's just dripping off of him and the physical toll of this war. And he's basically there for the end of it. So Richmond falls, and again, extraordinary. The president of the United States rides into Richmond.
It is one of the most, I think, cinematic moments in American history, and it gets weirdly short shrift in a lot of Lincoln biographies, even multi-volume ones. And I'm not quite sure why. It's relatively brief, but it comes at the culmination of the war. So here's the scene. Richmond finally falls. Lincoln is at the front lines. In part, he wants to focus the troops' attention on this great goal, which is the capture of Lee's army, but also the capture of Richmond. Once Richmond falls, the game is over. It's Petersburg, then Richmond. When he hears that it's finally fallen, he says, I want to go to Richmond. And Admiral Porter, who's with him in that painting, the Peacekeepers, which hangs in the White House famously, where it's Sherman, Grant, Lincoln, and Porter, tries to take him upriver in this sort of triumphal procession, but things don't go as planned. Actually, the presidential party almost dies in a bizarre accident involving a steamship wheel. Boats run aground. Anyway, Lincoln ends up getting rowed in a longboat the final step of the way. And there's nobody to greet him when they arrive in Richmond. The city is barely secured. It's still on fire in many places. Go on.
And he's with his son, Tad.
On Tad's 12th birthday.
Yeah. So the President of the United States and his 12-year-old are riding into the former capital of the Confederacy.
While it's still on fire, before it's been fully secured.
Yeah.
And there's no one to greet them. I mean, they literally land on the shores there in the James River, and there's no one to greet them. It's unimaginable for us today to see such an intimate, unassuming, frankly, incredibly dangerous moment. I mean, he's flanked by 12 soldiers and Admiral Porter and a handful of aides. He's recognized by some former slaves who are working, and he's clustered. He walks up the road past these burning buildings and abandoned slave markets, holding his son Tad's hand. And what's so striking, I think it's the moral humility of Lincoln that is so compelling ultimately. It's not that the man is without ambition. He's very ambitious. Yeah. But he has moral humility. And indeed, there's one moment where witnessed by a reporter named Charles Cohen, who wrote for the Boston Journal at the time, and where an elderly Black man takes off his hat and bows to President Lincoln, and Lincoln takes off his hat and bows in return. And Cohen says, this is centuries of caste have just been destroyed by this one gesture. And Lincoln, they're Confederates. They think they spy a Confederate sniper tracing the president's path. And he's just wandering through town until he happens to bump into a New York regiment. And they lead him to the Jefferson Davis's Confederate White House. And Lincoln speaks to the assembled crew. He sits in Jefferson Davis's chair. He looks out the same window. He meets with a couple of prominent Richmond residents. It's an amazing moment. All these contrasts and conflicts coming together, and him walking into town with this unassuming air with his boy on his son's 12th birthday.
And he's not coming as the conquering hero, which is demonstrated by his visit to a Confederate hospital.
Yes, there's no triumphalism with Lincoln. This is one of my favorite moments in the book. This is after he's left Richmond and he's had meetings, and there's threats of assassination, and he's been there. And the Depot Hospital, which is back at City Point, is the nation's biggest hospital at that point. It's a military hospital. And the vast majority of it is set up for wounded Union troops. And Lincoln, before he leaves, wants to go and greet each one and say thank you in a personal way and spend time with them. And as he's finishing up, and these are hundreds of beds, he spies another tent area cordoned off in the back. And he says, "What's that?" And the doctor who's trying to show him around says, "Oh, Mr. President, you don't need to go there. Those are just wounded Confederate rebel soldiers." And Lincoln says, "That's exactly where I do want to go." And he bolts and goes through, and then shows the same kindness and respect and personal attention to fallen Confederate soldiers. And it leaves a deep impression on each of those men who'd been dedicated to trying to destroy the Union and topple Lincoln if they could. And many of them realize that they've been fighting for a lie. They've been told that Lincoln is some vicious butcher, this demon, King Abraham Africanus I. And what they see is an unassuming, haggard man with kind eyes who treats them with dignity and respect. And it makes all the difference.
And he also stops I can't remember whether it's the Union soldiers or who wants to tear down the Libby prison, but the Confederate prison, he stops them from doing it.
Yeah, that's the opening scene in the book is Lincoln's walk into Richmond, and one of the culminating moments. He's touring Richmond in a carriage after visiting the Confederate White House, and the Libby prison is probably second only to Andersonville in terms of horrific prisoner of war camps, and it's a converted tobacco warehouse. And at the moment now it's housing Confederates, and indeed some former slaves are acting as guards along with Union troops. but the group of people who are following the carriage as he stops outside and tries to explain to Tad what has gone on the horrors that have gone on in this place. The crowd yells to Lincoln, "Tear it down." And Lincoln raises his hand and he says, "No, leave it as a monument." And there too, I think you see the prescience and the wisdom of Lincoln. It's the easiest thing in the world would be to say, yes, let's tear it down. This has been a terrible chapter in our history. Let's remove all markers of it to begin again. But what Lincoln's understanding is that no, we must actually confront our history so we can learn from our history. So our history is not forgotten, which itself will doom us to, recreating it. It's very prescient and I think very relevant to a lot of contemporary debates today.
So to our audience, we have about 10 minutes before the question and answer period begins. So we've got some questions already, but please feel free to ask some more. And I'll, so John, okay, the war's over. So I guess this takes me back to my question about what was uniquely Lincoln and what was in terms of the norms of the time or the code of soldiers, because as you mentioned, when the Confederate soldiers are turning in their rifles, they are, correct me if I'm wrong, they are saluted by the Union soldiers. So there's that military respect, but tie that story up for me and then reset us in terms of Lincoln's view once the war is over about how the Confederates and Confederacy should be treated in the South in general.
Sure. Well, those two impulses are entwined. And what you see very quickly is that Lincoln has been giving such clear, consistent orders, not only in the final paragraph of the second inaugural, but to all his generals, in writing, whether it's presidential proclamations about the nature of Reconstruction or, talking on the River Queen in the Peacemakers meeting, which is memorialized in that painting, that it trickles down through the ranks very quickly. So you see General Shipley, who actually oversees with Godfrey Weitzel, General Weitzel, a 29-year-old German immigrant who's overseeing the occupation of Richmond, that they are carrying forward the spirit that Lincoln has dictated to them. That it has been communicated through the ranks. There is no reason to believe that is an instinct that the vast majority of people would arrive on their own, because resentment's the most normal thing in the world. Mm-hmm. Resentment and the desire for revenge. To rise above that, to look at the long game, is what's so extraordinary. And indeed, Lincoln has begun this. I spent a lot of time talking about the second inaugural and what I call the New Testament leadership of the final paragraph. And his last speech, which is a very legalistic speech, but it also explicates his vision of Reconstruction, which itself says, look, we're going to focus on the big goals. It should be different in every state because we want buy-in. We can't have a one-size-fits-all here. But from the very beginning, he's saying, look, we should offer amnesty to the rank-and-file soldiers. He wants to, and he's pushing for this, which finally comes out in the final speech, to pair that amnesty with Black voting rights for the first time, right? He's passed the 13th Amendment. He already has the 15th Amendment in mind, but he's trying to seed it on a local level, which is one of the reasons why he's so fixated on Louisiana, because it has been more of a multiracial culture than many other states have been, particularly down in Louisiana, for all its horrors and complications. But he's always said, we're not going to allow the Confederate leaders to have amnesty. We're not going to hang them. We're not going to make martyrs of them, but we're not going to let them simply regain control of their property and power, because he understands that will send precisely the wrong signal. So he has this in mind, and it's rooted in kindness and common sense, but moving the country forward towards a multiracial democracy, not as fast as some folks would like. There's a really important quote by Frederick Douglass at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial, where he says, look, seen from the abolitionist ground, Lincoln was tardy, cool, and indifferent. But seen from the perspective of American politicians who were bound to consult the sentiment of the citizenry, he was radical, zealous, and determined. And it's that balance that Lincoln strikes just right.
It's very impressive. It's one of my favorite quotes, because for me, it symbolizes the challenge for all of us who are trying to see presidents in their time. Mm-hmm. And so here you have Douglas nailing it, and also seeing him in his time, in his job, in the obligations he had. And so it's exactly right. And there's a tactical benefit, which you've already mentioned, but if you smash the Confederacy too much, if you and we'll talk about this in terms of the lessons of Lincoln after World War I, after World War II, and the good and bad uses of Lincoln. That tactically, if you smash the opponent, you're going to get a backlash, and that was the strategic reason for this as well.
That's exactly right. That's what Lincoln, I think, intuited. He understood, for example, if there were vacuums of power, that vigilante bands would end up filling the space. A lot of what goes wrong when we fail to win the peace of Reconstruction are things that Lincoln was anticipating and was very much afraid of. It was the worst of both worlds under Andrew Johnson. But that's why I think as I say, his gradualism has a grandeur to it. He's trying to figure out how to create sustainable change. And that's true even in the way, for example, he treats the border states during the war. He wants to move everybody to a place where slavery is abolished, but he's wary of going too far too fast, lest you create that backlash. Lest, for example, you force the border states to the side of the Confederacy at a time when that could have been decisive and doomed the Union. And so it's a very holistic vision. It's about achieving a wise balance. And I think that's why he is the sort of, I call him a soulful centrist, but he is a reconciler in times of radicals and reactionaries.
So, but one more before we get to the Lincoln lessons afterwards. What do you think for him? So obviously there's the assassination, and his plans and thoughts for Reconstruction are not implemented, and no one with his fingertip feel for this careful balance. Basically, they find somebody who's the opposite.
Yeah.
They don't find somebody. He steps in.
Lincoln found somebody.
Right. Lincoln found something for other reasons, which is why the way we pick vice presidents is cockamamie, but that's another book. Anyway, what do you think his biggest challenges would have been as he tried to keep this careful balance had he lived?
Well, I do stay out of the what ifs, but it's an inevitable and interesting question. One of the things that shocked me is how quickly the black codes were passed in the southern states. So here Lincoln is trying not to endorse the radical Republicans' view. He wants a degree of federalism. And you see very quickly, for example, in Mississippi, a Confederate brigadier general become governor. And the black codes, which are basically these laws that are attempt to create the structures of slavery without the chains. Right? They're willing to accept the 13th Amendment in order to rejoin the Union, but they're going to try to make life as difficult as possible for freed blacks to recreate the caste system. Those laws start getting passed in the late summer and fall of 1865. And I think that would have really shown Lincoln, I think, the limits of his view that this could be done as sort of laboratories of democracy. And I do think that Lincoln would have had to have interceded faster on behalf of enshrining equal rights. I think that could have been salvaged by things like not abandoning the Freedmen's Bureau, which is this enormously far-sighted organization that Andrew Johnson basically guts the first chance he's got. But I do think very quickly he would need to confront the fact that a lot of the Southerners were not acting with the magnanimity which he hoped his magnanimity would inspire something in kind.
Right. And that's the big question. And it's a question for our day-to-day, our time today, because in our current debates, whenever anyone, let alone a leader or even anybody in the press, suggests kind of offering an olive branch to the other side, there's a huge chorus that says it won't do any good. You'll offer the olive branch and they'll just keep behaving the same way. And so...
And this bit of our history is a reason why that is so entrenched. But I do think what Lincoln shows is it's the combination of strength with mercy. I mean, Lincoln believes that decency can be the most practical form of politics if people are greeted from a position of strength. That's why they have to accept defeat. They have to admit they're whipped. And then you could reach out and build them back up. But you got to do both. Right.
Which I'm just going to steal one quick question from the questions before I return to it. But there's Wesley Brown says, it seems to me the Confederates were indeed smashed, Sherman's scorched earth campaign, etc. It seems to tee up what you just said, though. There's a distinction between what you need to do to win the war and then what happens after you've thoroughly defeated the enemy.
That's right. That is the crucial distinction. I mean, Lincoln is he develops this called the Lieber Code, which is basically the first rules of war, which end up informing everything from the Geneva Conventions to the Nuremberg trials. But he also believes that that quick wars are more merciful. I mean, you shouldn't fight with one hand tied behind your back. His frustration with his generals up to Grant was that they hadn't been aggressive enough, and that only prolongs the war. So he has no problem with the Shermans and the Grants of the world. In fact, they're the ones who finally are pursuing his vision of how you prosecute the war. But that's solely to get them to admit defeat so they can be built back up. And that's what never happens, really.
So before we turn to audience questions, the lessons of Lincoln or the misuse of or the mistakes in not following what Lincoln was trying to do. I guess let's do just Wilson and Truman, the two different responses after the wars.
And I'll do them briskly, but I think that ends up becoming the proving ground because it gives us a lens to test Lincoln's hypothesis without going into the what ifs. I mean, we know that Andrew Johnson's opposite approach, rooting in really his opposite personality and character traits, was a disaster. We saw things get briefly back on track with Grant, particularly with the passage of the anti-KKK enforcement acts, which are now back in the news, by the way, because they've been used to prosecute in civil arrangements, things like the Charlottesville violence and are even being invoked around January 6th. And importantly, Grant has a Southern Attorney General, Amos T. Ackerman, implement this and prosecute the Klan, which is I mean, Round Chernow does a great job explicating this, but I mean, this guy is a forgotten American hero. And that's a very smart tactic straight out of Lincoln. But there's the corrupt bargain of 1876, Reconstruction ends, we definitively lose the peace to the extent that reconciliation is given precedent over anything resembling emancipation, and segregation follows slavery for 100 years. Woodrow Wilson is a child of the war. He's the only American president to grow up in a state that has lost a war. His father is a Presbyterian minister who comes up with these biblical, has a pamphlet from his sermons about the biblical justifications for slavery. He sees Jefferson Davis getting brought through the streets. His family suffers during Reconstruction. And he's the first president from the Deep South elected, or from the South, elected since the Civil War in 1912. Now, he's governor of New Jersey, but that's a peculiarity of the fact that that's where he's president of the University of Princeton, right? You can see, not only in his resegregation of the federal government, which is a fundamental contradiction of any claim to be a progressive, the legacy of his background and his bigotry in this case, but his preoccupation in the run-up to the First World War, that there can be a peace among equals, which is what he says to the Senate, a peace without victory. And you can just see it's reflecting his own experience. He doesn't want that kind of resentment to fester. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, he's going in with the right attitude, but then two critical things happen. He doesn't listen or isn't aware of Lincoln, who he's come to admire, that whole idea about no ceasefire before surrender. So instead, you have armistice, and then we'll work out the details. That creates the protracted negotiations at Versailles. Lincoln looms large. I mean, Clemenceau, the French prime minister, has actually worked as a reporter covering Reconstruction in the United States. David Lloyd George grew up with a picture of Lincoln over the mantelpiece in his little house in Wales and quotes Lincoln all the time. So, Lincoln is very much alive, but they end up with the worst of all worlds. They have these tough terms, massive reparations, minimal means of enforcing these tough terms, and a Germany that never accepts defeat because it's never had troops on its soil, which gives birth to a new lost cause mythology in the form of Nazism. In the Second World War, that generation is both looking to Lincoln and is deeply informed by the failures of the Treaty of Versailles. They begin actively trying to figure out how can we win the peace. Roosevelt, FDR, takes up the mantle of unconditional surrender. That's the official policy he and Churchill announced in Casablanca. And when he's asked to explain it, he does a whole story about Lee and Grant at Appomattox. So it's very much of the mind. And you see in the occupations of Germany and Japan, and then the Marshall Plan, the exact opposite. They invest in peace. They insist on unconditional surrender, but then they have a magnanimous peace, and in particular, the Marshall Plan, where Truman, who himself is a descendant of Southern sympathizers and remarks often about the resentment that the Southerners felt, or him in being in Missouri, a border state, in the wake of the war. He says, "I don't want resentment to be this generation's gift to the next." He and Marshall cultivate Arthur Vandenberg, the Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, to get bipartisan support for the Marshall Plan, convince the American people to forego a peace dividend. It's targeted, it's 3 years. A Republican runs it, the head of the Studebaker Corporation. But it is a bipartisan effort to sell this to the American people, and it makes all the difference in the world. It is the opposite of reparations. It's an investment in peace. And that has created the international order, the liberal democracy in Europe, which not only has 75 years of peace and prosperity, which is unheard of in the history of Europe, but is what's being challenged right now as we speak with Vladimir Putin. But it worked. It worked. Boy, did it work. And that was an idea that was bequeathed from Lincoln.
Right, let's jump into the audience questions here. I don't want to hog the stage for the entire evening. Let's see, Jennifer, I apologize, your name is cut off here, but Jennifer asks, would Lincoln have hosted Robert E. Lee at the White House as Grant did?
Well, no, but he does host his sister-in-law, who is the widow of a Confederate general who dies at Chickamauga, and there is huge outcry. It's during the war. Now, obviously, it's a gesture to family, but Unionists are accusing the Lincolns of sheltering Confederates, which in fact they literally are. She doesn't renounce the Confederacy. But they're trying to set an example about the post-war magnanimity that they're promising. Again, I want to be careful about the what ifs, but he's very careful beginning in his proclamation about his vision of Reconstruction, which is in December of 1864. He is very careful to say that, look, high-level officers, members of the judiciary, members of Congress, who have left the Union, joined the Confederacy and the rebellion, will not get amnesty. I mean, notably Arlington, which was Lee's house, is turned into the graveyard for our fallen dead. So he was not, he didn't want to make an example of these people by killing them. And in his last morning alive, his son Robert gives him a portrait of Lee, and he says, "Look at it." He says, "Look, that looks like a kind face, a wise face." But I don't think that he would have been elevating Lee. That was the opposite of what he wanted to do with the leading Confederates.
Jay Mendez asks, and I'm going to add a little sidecar of my own, but are Lincoln's speeches better read or heard out loud? I'll ask that. It's a double barrel question. I'll ask that. So just answer that one first.
Well, it raises a great question because, of course, we have no recordings of Lincoln, but, for a long time, it's the Gregory Peck baritone that you imagine, because we have this image of such a graven President Lincoln, which is partly a function of portraiture at the time. He's in fact a guy who jokes all the time, tells stories all the time. He speaks in parables, and he has not a baritone, but a tenor. And what I describe as a reedy Kentucky tenor, and David Herbert Donald does a great job describing it, but I could never imagine it till I heard Daniel Day-Lewis and Lincoln. Yeah. And he did the right research. He kind of Alan Lomaxed it and try to figure out, where in Knob Creek, Kentucky, and then Indiana, and but I think he caught it. Yeah, I think he really did. They're brilliant. I say this as a former speechwriter, but I mean, as a historian, as someone who loves writing and literature and politics, you can't, the last paragraph in particular of the second inaugural, you could meditate on for years.
Yeah.
People have.
And he wrote them with a mind to saying them out loud.
Yes, he wrote for the ear.
Some that aren't done that way in life, but
he would read them aloud, which was also a technique that Hamilton used. He would write them longhand on boxboard, on using his legs as a structure. He had a standing desk primarily in his office in the White House. I love those kind of details.
So then the second question is, which current political leader best exemplifies Lincoln's approach to politics? And I guess what I would add to that is, they all hang Lincoln's pictures somewhere real close at hand. They're the permanent Lincoln pictures, but they all get to choose what hangs in the Oval Office. And most of them get Lincoln in there as a bust or on the wall or something. And as I was reading, it struck me that we've never, I mean, well, you'll answer this question, but I mean, who has come closest to, I mean, he didn't just extend the olive branch, he extended the whole olive tree, a grove of olive trees in a way. I mean, when you think about what the Confederate States had done, I mean, so anyway, who do you think?
So judging solely by that, which is in some ways an easier question, the example of magnanimity, I think you have to say Truman, because he oversaw the Marshall Plan, the investment in peace. Yeah. They're very dissimilar people in some respects, but there is sort of they both have sort of a backwoods common sense, but a deep intelligence born of reading history. I mean, Truman is not a lawyer. Truman neither is formally educated, which maybe is an endorsement for that, not over-indexing that. I mean, Eisenhower, I think, also had an understanding of the balance of powers. In terms of contemporary figures, that's a tough question. We're not going to find another Lincoln, but you can find people who I think have a similar spirit, as I say. What you can see is the people who are the opposite of Lincoln, the people who always divide and destroy and demean and demonize. I will say, the personality of Angus King, an independent senator from Maine, and his use of humor and common sense and his sort of dislike of hewing to either extremes without being sort of transactional. I think he has Lincoln-esque qualities.
Well, Tyler asks, was Lincoln qualified to be president after only one term in the House? So you can answer that, and I'll add to it, which is that how would you, if you were trying to test for these qualities, how would you try to find another Lincoln if you're testing for the qualities that you've rightly put your finger on, that empathy, honesty, humor, humility?
It's just a reminder that character is the most important quality in a president. And you can define character any number of different ways, and it's not a cookie cutter thing, but it needs to be actually the preeminent question we ask ourselves. Any number of other good qualities in the absence of character will still end up in some form of tragedy and disaster. And, I recently read and interviewed Brian Klass, who's got a book called Corruptible. I did a series at CNN called Reality Check. And basically it was, why do sociopaths succeed? And he talked about dark triad, qualities and Machiavellianism and psychopathy and these things that tend to lead people to climb up a ladder until they can do great damage. But I do think just simply vetting for character. I mean, Lincoln's no executive experience, one term in Congress, no military experience. On paper, it is a disaster. Yeah. But it's his decency. One of the comforting things for me, and I wrote this during the Trump years, so having Lincoln to come home to at night was kind of medicine. But it was a reminder that kindness can be consistent with effective leadership. That is one of the most important things to me.
Well, and you conveyed that when you were talking about the way in which his vision for treating the Confederates, with its human quality, but also its strategic quality, was conveyed to those below him, because that's what leadership does. It makes it contagious. So yeah. Susan asks, how can America learn to live together again with the outsized partisan role the media plays today?
Well, the media plays an outsized role. I mean, it's kind of a compared to what question. I mean, there were newspapers with strong opinions, and the New York World was reflexively pro-Democrat and even pro-Confederate. And we don't want to turn the past into anything resembling an Eden, especially a pre-Civil War or Civil War America. Indeed, I think one of the virtues of studying the Civil War right now is to remind us that we've been through far worse before. Mm-hmm. And we are a sturdy people as long as we are trying to aim, to form a more perfect union, which is what Lincoln did. Lincoln read newspapers all the time. He actually was a silent investor in a German language newspaper at a time when that was very controversial. So he could deal with the rough and tumble, but he always kept his eye on the horizon, that horizon of reconciliation, and that makes all the difference. If his rise itself is so improbable. I mean, a rebellious third party. I mean, It's an extraordinary story that I tell in swift strokes. But I don't think the partisan media is a real problem, and social media is a real problem. But at the time, they were partisan media and telegraphs. I mean, and we were objectively worse off as a nation in almost every respect then.
Jay, I've already given a question to him there. Hold on. Susan Libman says, is the inherent flaw in America's idea of democracy that a great leader like Lincoln is gunned down with his penchant for violence culminating in junior? Not sure. I'm not sure what that question is. I guess I guess the question is, if Lincoln was gunned down for what he tried to do, and there's violence behind January 6th, is this embedded in America?
So often I think we ask questions about America, and what we're really asking is about humanity. I mean, the epigraph of the book I chose is a fairly obscure quote that he offers after winning the 1864 election, where he says, in effect, that in any future great trial, we shall have as men as good and as bad, as silly and as wise as men of this. So let us therefore try to learn this as philosophy to learn wisdom from, not as wrongs to be revenged. That's part of why I think applied history has so much appeal. It is our legacy. We should be guided by it. We should not be constrained by it. There's nothing, that should make us feel fatalistic about the American character simply because a Lincoln or a King or a Kennedy's are shot down. If anything, it should remind us that we've been relatively insulated from those sorts of incidents. But it should not cause us, when we see people echoing talk of a second Civil War today, we should greet that with the kind of disgust that can only come from being informed by history and the suffering of 750,000 dead the last time we did this. We're not going to have a civil war. We need to be informed by history. We need to be guided by the better angels of our nature. And we hear people articulating arguments that are echoes of our ugliest chapters, or the people who ended up being clearly on the wrong side of history. Beware. Don't follow those folks.
It is extraordinary. Again, we've touched on this, but the number of people who quote and talk about Lincoln and celebrate him on President's Day, and yet don't show even the tiniest thimble of this quality that you examine in the book, even in small private dealings. It's anyway, striking. Jean-Paul Marie, I can't read the rest of the name. Who did Lincoln trust as his political confidant?
Good question. Doris Kearns Goodwin famously detailed the team of rivals. I think at the end of the day, Seward and Stanton were probably his closest advisors at the end of the war, Seward being the more political of the two, Stanton being the Secretary of War. But he really did take his own counsel. His secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, speak about how one of the reasons why he was so hated by some of his contemporaries who thought they were his superiors was that he was not going to be dictated to by anybody. He was very confident in taking his own counsel, but he would listen to other people. He would not bristle when there was disagreement.
I guess we can do this last as your last question here, as it becomes 7 o'clock. Process. So Janine Woodworth asks, how long did your research take, and where did you go to do this research?
Wow, I could talk shop all day long, because for me, the research and the crafting is part of the fun of this. I tried not to read very recent Lincoln books. I try to sort of keep really contemporary books out of my head. And I would sort of go down to as many sort of contemporaries who left their own records, realizing that in some cases you need to take them with a grain of salt, particularly the further they get from the incident itself. I used a great researcher named Jesse Rifkin, who I thank copiously in the book, where I would find something fairly obscure and say, see what you can find. Sometimes it's a New York Times article from 1918 where a guy who's an Illinois senator who was with Lincoln in the Illinois state legislature was reflecting on the lessons of leadership he learned when he was head of the Whig Party. He said he would not club people into submission. He ruled by reason. But really the fun of it is collecting all these disparate threads and then coming up with your own retelling that hopefully adds something new to the conversation. But I had a wonderful time writing this book. And I've got to say, you know, spending 4 years with Lincoln, I could have spent 4 more, but it's amazing. He doesn't disappoint. He doesn't disappoint.
You mentioned that in a couple of different places. Lincoln is that rare person who does not disappoint upon closer study. That is rare because
it is.
And on President's Day, it's a useful sort of, it's the exception that proves the rule, because most of the other ones, while their fortunes have risen and fallen, and some have risen since they left office, obviously Truman has, but they have some pretty, you know, rough things that you discover about them. But he didn't in your research.
He has plenty of flaws, and yes, he's very human, but being mean and petty and dividing people into different groups, he consistently is aware. It's the definition of character. It's what you do when you think no one's looking, except in the presidency. That elevates everything, and he behaved like the eyes of history were on him, and that elevated his game and elevated the game of everyone around him, to the point where decades after he was gone, his acolytes were spreading sort of the gospel of Lincoln and carrying it forward.
Right. John Avlon, thank you. This has been a real pleasure. The book is Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. Everybody buy it from Politics and Prose.
Yes, please.
And Matthew, I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you very much. It was a fascinating discussion and a wonderful book, perfect for these times of ours. And like John said, you can buy it from our website. There's a link in the chat column. So please support John Avlon and Politics and Prose by picking up a copy. It helps us bring you events like these. And please check out the website for our list of upcoming events. We have many to choose from. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you to John and John. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Great. Take care.